Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first IT at Cork Tech Talk of 2021. My name is Juliet Crowley, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer with IT at Cork. Now, I know most of you are familiar with IT at Cork, but for those of you who aren't, we are the leading member-based association for IT professionals in the southwest of Ireland. Our members include startups, SMEs, and multinationals from all sectors, and we focus on the technology aspect of their companies, covering a range of technologies, including cybersecurity, AI, IoT, biotech, agri-tech, fintech, and so on. So we focus mainly on helping our members to upskill in technology and connect with their peers, whilst also working to raise their company profile in the region. We run a number of event streams, and this Tech Talk stream is one of our key strands. So in this morning's Tech Talk, we will be looking at eForensics and financial crime, which is extremely important to everybody in the business community across both the public and private sectors. So we will focus particularly this morning on new challenges and managing the risk of financial crime. I'd like to thank the IT at Cork Tech Talk Committee for organising this event, and to our panellists for giving us their time and expertise this morning. So just briefly, our panellists this morning include Bernard Ayers, who's a Forensic Director at KPMG, Paul Ho, who's a Forensic Technology Director at KPMG, Katrina Gunn, who's Detective Superintendent at the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, and Paul O'Brien, who's on the security team with Bank of Ireland. And our MC this morning is Rachel Pinkard, who's the Internal Audit Manager at Fexco. So I hope you all enjoyed this event, and I'm sure it's going to be highly interactive. I'll now hand over to Rachel and just ask you to note that the event is being recorded and there will be an opportunity for questions, so please feel free to post on the Q&A facility. Over to you now, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. I'm delighted to welcome everyone this morning for what promises to be a very interesting and thought-provoking Tech Talk. I read a survey recently which said that Irish economic crime, it was done by one of the big four accountancy firms, and they found that 51% of Irish respondents experienced economic crime in the last 24 months, which just underscores how important this area is for all businesses. Our four panelists today are not only highly qualified, but they also have great practical experience. Each is going to have some time to talk and share their knowledge with us. And at the end, like Juliet said, we will have time for Q&As. So do please use the chat box to put anything that you want to know in. Our first speaker today is Bernard Ayers, and he's a director in KPMG's forensic practice. He joined KPMG in 2008. He's been involved in the forensic accounting profession for over 15 years and has gained considerable experience in the provision of investigation and dispute resolution services. If that's not enough, he also delivers the Institute's Diploma in Forensic Accounting and Investigation. So it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Bernard Ayers.
Thank you, Rachel. Firstly, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk here today. As Rachel mentioned, I am a director in KPMG's forensic practice and focusing on financial crime and investigations, where we specialize in working with organizations to develop and improve their financial crime compliance framework, and also to undertake fraud and regulatory investigations in response to breaches to their internal control environments. Today, I want to talk to you about financial crime and the heightened risk that organizations face due to remote working, and that organizations face, and how organizations can mitigate this risk. So firstly, what is financial crime? There is no single definition of financial crime in Irish law. Money laundering, bribery and corruption, cybercrime, handling the proceeds of crime, and accounting and tax fraud are all considered financial crimes. The list is endless and constantly changing. Simply put, it is somebody defrauding, manipulating, or circumventing established rules for financial gain, your rules. My fellow panelists will discuss some of the types of scams and frauds that are prevalent at the moment, but I want to focus on the importance of the day-to-day business controls and the human factor required to ensure that these controls are effective. Remote working challenges. The way we work has changed, with the majority of us now working at home due to COVID, and a lot of us are likely to see a permanent shift to remote working in the post-COVID world. A survey carried out last year of Irish businesses identified that 9 of 10 businesses felt the threat of a financial crime had increased, and that as they adapted to new working practices. Over 25% of the businesses surveys believe this to be a considerable risk. This remoteness has increased the threat of both internal and external financial crime for most organizations. For example, remote working and the greater use of less secure home networks increases fraud and cyber risks. In addition, enterprise-wide controls to prevent and detect fraud and network breaches may not be designed to operate in 100% virtual environments. Manual controls that businesses once relied on have become redundant, and controls have been dropped due to lack of oversight. Employee vigilance against threats may be diminished as they struggle to meet the demands in their work from home environment while also trying to homeschool the kids. Or simply not having that person who used to sit beside you there anymore to soundboard things off may result in poor judgment being exercised that puts your organization at risk. Also, the impact of mental well-being and the feelings of detachment from work due to cycles of lockdown cycles and anxieties due to job security could tip employees to become an internal threat to your organization. We've also seen some businesses pivot to take advantage of the opportunities to meet the needs of the crisis. For example, we have seen alcohol producers now producing and selling hand sanitizers and wholesalers buying PPE equipment from China. These changes present new financial risks which require new controls which need to be designed and tested in your organization. Our experience over the last 9 months is that the risk-based approach to financial crime prevention and detection has been extremely challenging for a lot of organizations. The crisis has exacerbated fraud risks and showcased existing weaknesses in internal controls. This was mainly driven by higher detection risk in the context of remote work, as well as the increased burden on organizations' IT systems and the lack of direct oversight of employees. More than ever, organizations need to be vigilant to the risks. Fraudsters are rapidly adjusting their approaches to take advantage of this crisis. They are aware that businesses are still adapting and they are looking for opportunities, looking for that back door that may have been left open and take advantage. Our advice is to be internal control framework to ensure that it is effective in a remote working environment. Having the right controls in place is fundamental to protecting your business and mitigating the risk of financial crime. It is worth asking yourself, since COVID, have you tested the existing business controls to see if they are working in a remote environment? In our experiences, some businesses have assumed that the existing operational controls have continued to be effective because they have not identified instances of fraud or cybercrime. We strongly advise against adopting this approach, as the time and cost of remediation and investigation are likely to be considerable. The reality is that the risks have changed, and these changes will require modifications to financial crime compliance programs, including modifying and reinforcing controls, which may include updating your financial crime and fraud risk assessments, changes to customer onboarding requirements to compensate for the lack of face-to-face contact, greater use of data analytics and tools to identify hidden underlying relationships, revising scenario thresholds to reflect changes in customer activity. You also need to ask yourself, are you confident that new controls put in place for remote working purposes are fully understood by those who need to implement them on a day-to-day basis? Training people remotely is a challenge today. We need to be mindful that this is still a new and challenging environment for a lot of our employees, and adapting to this is taking time. I recommend focusing on educating employees and creating awareness of new and emerging financial crime risks. And finally, the need to continue monitoring and testing, notwithstanding the added challenges resulting from working remotely. Now is not the time to ease up on monitoring and testing financial crime compliance programs. It is imperative that gaps are identified and addressed quickly to protect your organization from suffering a financial loss and undue compliance and reputational risk. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Paul. Oh, sorry, thanks a million, Bernard. Next up is Paul. He's a colleague of Bernard's, and he's also a director with KPMG, and he leads the forensic technology function. He's over 14 years experience in the industry. He advises KPMG's clients on the development and implementation of strategies that use technology to their benefit in data security, remediation, litigation, investigation, regulatory response, and compliance. So over to you, Paul.
Smashing. Thank you, Rachel, and hi to everyone. There's quite a broad range of topics to cover in relation to financial crime, and the panelists here will be discussing different areas, but I was going to take the next 8 to 10 minutes to discuss probably two key areas: existing and emerging threats, and secondly the proactive versus the reactive approach to investigations and incident response. So if we look at emerging threats, the things we're seeing in relation to financial crime, especially from a data and IT perspective, the frauds themselves are probably not new to anyone on the call, I would say, but the maturity and the sophistication that they're being executed with is certainly increasing. Two of the most prominent types of attacks we're continuing to see with our clients are the ransomware attack, which I'm sure everyone on the call is sick of hearing about, and the Friday evening or what we would call the CEO frauds. If we look at the ransomware attacks, firstly, the traditional attack was orchestrated on an opportunistic basis. The cost of the market entry for the fraudster was almost nothing. They take a phishing email, it's issued to an endless set of email addresses, and if the link is clicked on, the payload is activated and any accessible data is encrypted, along with the ransom note being issued, usually to pay Bitcoin in some format. But more recently, what we're seeing is a much more sophisticated version of the attack in that individual companies and their employees are starting to be targeted. The incubation period for these attacks are often in excess of 90 days. So from the point of entry by a bad actor to when the execution of the ransomware attacks occurs can be 90 days. And for these 90 days, the attacker's identifying data in the system, where the backups are set, and what's most valuable to the business. So then once the attack occurs, we're seeing ransom notes again becoming much more user-friendly, with idiot guides to buying Bitcoin and a full customer service help desk available to the targets, where you can ask questions and get helpful responses from the attacker, all with the aim, of course, of making it as easy as possible to pay the ransom. We had a case recently for a large SME where on investigation we found that the attacker had been in the environment for in excess of 90 days. By then the attacker had a detailed understanding of the IT infrastructure, the price points the company were likely to pay, and the best time to execute. And when they finally did undertake the attack, it was executed on a Friday evening to ensure the most available time between Friday and Monday before any issues were identified. The attackers also had identified a map drive to the backup environment on a separate domain, and so not only were they able to encrypt the live environment, but they were also able to ensure that the business could not restore from backup, which would have been the traditional resolution of a ransomware attack. The ransom notice then provided a per server price list for restoration and a hugely helpful help desk with immediate response to questions. So in 48 hours, like a reasonably tech-enabled company was reduced to paper and pen to try and maintain operations. And in this situation, there's very limited options other than either to start over with any data that can be recovered by standing up a new environment, or consider paying the ransom, which is very, very rarely a good idea, but unfortunately sometimes occurs. I read a report the other day that where they've been tracking one ransomware gang who've managed to take 24 million in the first 9 months of 2020 globally. So it is a profitable business to be in. Not suggesting anyone should, but it is a profitable business to be in. The second area we're continuing to see more and more cases of is the Friday evening or CEO fraud or payment redirection, whatever you want to call it, especially with the easing of the controls due to COVID. This is a fraud that's been around forever and can be as simple as ringing a finance department and providing new bank account details for a payment, or more sophisticated execution whereby the attacker gains access to an environment and perpetrates the fraud from within. As more and more companies move their email environment from behind the firewall into the cloud, they become much more vulnerable to this attack. A very good example of this, which we dealt with recently, was an organization who'd recently moved their email to O365. The implementation was perhaps not as strong as it should have been, and so the organization did not require a complex password, and they were using single-factor authentication. The CEO of the business, as often happens, clicked on a phishing email sent to him by a third party which had embedded malware, and this happened over 100 days before the attack, and this was the point of entry for the attacker. The attacker then went set up a number of rules on Office 365 which control the flow of communication between the CFO and their team, and then when the time came to execute, the attacker issued an email from the CFO's account to the finance team member instructing payment of $750,000 to a specific bank account. The email had the finance director CC'd in for a secondary authorization. However, on closer inspection during the investigation, the financial controller's email address had been falsified. The address had zeros instead of O's, for example. The attacker then used the falsified account to secondary authorize the payment, and the finance team member, unaware of any issues, exited $750,000 from the business. So these types of attacks are now the norm, unfortunately, as opposed to the exception. However, I would say it's not all doom and gloom. As Bernard already mentioned, having the right controls backed by an informed workforce and a security conscious IT team, and these threats can be somewhat mitigated, I would say. The second element I want to touch on briefly is the proactive versus the reactive approach to managing financial crime in your business. Again, probably from the IT and data perspective. As you would expect in an incident response service such as ours, the vast majority of cases we become involved in is in response to an incident that's already occurred. There's been some level of investigation already undertaken by the business, and they require support or alternatively validation of those steps. And each time we undertake an investigation, we learn something new, but there are certainly common themes that we see from business to business, and I wanted to talk through very quickly some of those. The first is is the relationship between the different parties that are required to come together in response to an incident. There's usually IT, legal, internal audit, finance, compliance, etc. Involved in these, and these situations are usually highly emotive, stressful situations for the business, senior stakeholders expecting immediate answers. More often than not, we find there's probably no clear ownership of the response. There's somewhat a mentality of, I'm not getting my fingerprints on that, coupled with a general lack of communication between the different parties. And we've seen a number of investigations suffer due to the different stakeholders' agendas or lack of understanding of the desired outcomes. For example, like the IT team's agenda in response is probably focused on collating evidence, addressing security gap, restore and maintain IT BAU, which is very different to compliance and legal, who are trying to understand breakdown in the controls, repercussions for the business, reporting obligations, whereas finance are probably more interested in addressing liquidity, payment controls, cash flow, etc. So we found that the more prepared companies who have some level of incident response playbook in place, or at the very least designated roles in place and open communication channels, ensures a much smoother and, more importantly, I suppose, quicker incident recovery. Another area where we see issues when being brought in to support an incident is in relation to the business understanding of their IT environment. Often on the back of acquisitions or extended underspend in IT infrastructure and security, legacy technologies exist that's not patched or not secured in any meaningful way, and invariably these legacy issues are backdoors for a bad actor to enter your environment. And as I mentioned earlier, they will sit there for extended periods before executing their attack. When the weakness is identified, the reason is almost always some variation of something along the lines of, we built a stock management platform on server 2003 back in the day, and we can't get it to work on any other platform. So we've always kept that box plugged in, or we only turn on that box from time to time, and so it isn't active really, so we don't patch it, or just lack of resources and prioritization, I suppose. I always think I had an interesting matter in Christmas 2019, so all pre-COVID, when we were allowed to wander the streets, where a chain of pubs had their stock till system brought down by ransomware in what would be one of the busiest weeks of their year. And when we were working through the IT environment to try and get them back up and running, it turned out that the guy who looked after their IT worked in the pub for a summer before going to college, and so nothing had been patched or backed up for months. So they were in the worst possible situation. The last element is in relation to the business understanding of data and how it's retained in the organization. Inevitably, the understanding that the business has of how and where data is stored versus IT's versus a third party provider always differs. It's only when you need to access information on the back of an incident or as part of an investigation that these issues come to light. Having a very detailed understanding of the retention policies and a regular testing of these policies are very important, both from incident response perspective, but also to ensure business are carrying out unnecessary data, which is falling foul of, say, GDPR or is a discoverable data set in an investigation. There have been a number of cases where we've had the volume of data, and with it the costs, the risks, the timelines increase significantly because legal and IT have been unable to agree on a retention strategy, and so everything gets retained indefinitely. We recently had an interesting investigation for a large organization which hinged on a number of emails which had been deleted immediately after sending by an individual. As the business ran a strong O365 environment and on paper had a full backup and archiving platform in place with a third party, the business is very comfortable that they had these emails and they could be recovered and provided to us. It's only when we went to extract these emails that the third party who managed the archiving solution told us that they only archived live email, and so nothing in the deleted folder, and so it was archived, and so all the key emails were lost. So some upfront testing, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get across with the IT environment in the context of an incident, ensures that the business are more prepared and can address the inevitable. So look, I appreciate that was a lot of me talking in a short period, but the key points I would say are: ensure you have an incident plan in place which defines roles and responsibilities. Ensure your IT team have a detailed understanding of your IT environment and that anything external facing is secured appropriately. Don't let controls lapse due to environmental changes such as COVID, and be proactive in your testing. They'd be probably the big takeaways for me anyway.
Thanks a million. I'm getting more frightened as the
Sorry. It's always easier to tell the worst case scenario.
No, but it's very interesting. But I'm actually writing notes here beside me, going, okay, right, well. So next up we have Katrina Gunn. She's a detective superintendent, and she's attached to the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau. She's 20 years experience in the area of fraud, financial crime and financial intelligence. And Katrina is a senior investigating officer. She's been involved in numerous complex financial and economic crime prosecutions. She's responsibility for the Financial Intelligence Unit, Money Laundering Investigation Units, and Anti-Bribery Corruption Unit. She's also an expert in payment card fraud and has spent a lot of her early career targeting organised crime gangs in this area. So over to you, Katrina.
Thank you, Rachel, and hi to everyone this morning. My aim for today's talk is to prevent one of you or your company from being the next victim of fraud. As Bernard said, fraudsters are opportunistic, but they're also very persistent. And I've made a career out of investigating the trail of destruction that they leave behind. So the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau was originally set up as the Fraud Squad in '95. And then it became the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation. And now it's the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau. But in that time, we have seen a lot of cyber-enabled fraud. And it has progressed a lot. But our main remit is to investigate serious and complex economic crime, to proactively prevent and disrupt criminals engaged in this activity. And we also operate and maintain a central repository for financial crime intelligence. So that's in relation to normal financial crime, but also money laundering and terrorist financing. So as I said, fraudsters are opportunistic, and with cyber-enabled crime, they've taken the opportunity of the COVID crisis. So Ireland has seen itself, and the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau has been involved in an international Interpol-led investigation involving the procurement of PPE masks. So back in April 2020, a German governing body, which would have been like a county council here, went to procure 10 million masks at a cost of 15 million. They went on to a supplier site that they'd used before, a Spanish company, and unbeknownst to them, they were on a false website. And they were told that due to supply issues that 2 intermediary companies needed to be involved, one based in Ireland and the other in the Netherlands. They were asked to send 1.5 million to Ireland for deposit and 880,000 to the Netherlands. So that was done, and they duly did that. And then they went, the German officials went over to the Netherlands company in relation to looking at the quality and that before they were going to purchase more. And they saw that the factory there was for engineering equipment, nothing to do with masks. So they then got in touch with law enforcement, who in turn got in touch with Interpol. So in relation to the 1.5 million that went to Ireland, the work of the Financial Intelligence Unit here at the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, we were able to recall the 1.5 million. But that Interpol investigation led to arrests here in Ireland, in the Netherlands, and in Nigeria, where out of 880,000, 550,000 had gone to Nigeria. So the simple message is to know who you're dealing with. And if you're asked to deal with third intermediary companies, is this outside the norm? And question, why are we being asked to do this? Also, fraudsters have made use of both smishing and phishing. So the latest smishing scam is in relation to the vaccine, that you've been called, you're called for the vaccine and we're going to give you an appointment. However, we need your personal data, your name, your address, your DOB, your mother's maiden name. And then what we're seeing that they're using that information to then apply for the pandemic payment. We also had a phishing incident where the court services officially purporting to be from the court services, again, using that data, 175,000 was defrauded from the Department of Social Protection in relation to fraudulent HUP applications. So we have members of An Garda Síochána seconded to the Department of Social Protection. So, and they report they're doing a lot of work there. And what we're going to see more of is, now that revenue are going through what's owed to revenue in relation to the pandemic payments, we're going to see a lot more that if your identity was taken, it's only now that you'll be informed from revenue you owe this bill that we'll see an increase in those type of payments, of those type of frauds for those payments. Just then, in relation to CEO fraud and business email scams, they have really upsurged in the last few months. And what the new element to really the CEO fraud, and what Paul was saying, it's normally on a Friday evening or it's near month end at busy times. But what we are actually seeing is a WhatsApp message. So you're getting a WhatsApp message purporting to be from the CEO or the chief finance officer, saying that they need to buy plant machinery or they need to do something urgent. It's always urgent, and they need you to transfer these funds, and they're authorized or that confidence that that this is fine, and lulling you into a false sense of security that I have this. We then are seeing that we're seeing that when the email comes, then that the phishing email comes with the bank details, that they're just transferring the funds. One of the main problems is time. Time is of the essence with the reporting. So some of these frauds aren't seen till month end or for days, but time is of the essence, that if for recalls and that, to get the money back. We're also seeing a new link in relation to romance fraud and business email compromises. In relation to the romance fraud, is that especially now during COVID, and people have lack of they're not getting out and social networking and meeting people. So then they're using social networking and forming relationships over time. And these rich people need assistance in transferring their funds. So they have been then, not only are they a victim of romance fraud, they've also been duped into, we had a case there a couple of weeks ago where a lady went online and transferred, was given passwords for bank accounts and transferred 650,000 from a German account to the Netherlands. So not alone is she a victim of romance fraud, she's also engaging in money laundering. So she reported that matter to An Garda Síochána, and we're working with Interpol in relation to it. So I could talk and I could give numerous stories, but hopefully now in the Q&A I will get to go into some detail in relation to phishing and smishing and what we're seeing in relation to the financial institutions, and Paul will be covering that. But one of the main things too is underreporting. The Garda National Economic Crime Bureau would have a lot of underreporting, and this could be due to reputational damage. But just remember that if it's an internal controls or if it's an employee and recruitment, and be very conscious of who you're engaging in your employment. But remember that that person then moves on. Thank you.
You just froze there for a second, but
Okay.
you're back just at the end. But thank you so much, Katrina. Our final panelist today is Paul O'Brien. Paul works in Bank of Ireland's security team and has been involved in financial crime and fraud prevention for almost 10 years. His role revolves around understanding current and emerging threats and investigating fraud cases, and he sees how businesses are impacted on a day-to-day basis by financial crime. So I'm going to hand you over to Paul now.
Thanks, Rachel, and hi everyone. It's great to get the chance to talk to you all this morning. I'm not sure whether it's a good or a bad thing to be last up, but I'll do my best to maybe look at things from a slightly different perspective and not to repeat too much of what's already been covered. As Rachel said, I'm Paul O'Brien and I work in Bank of Ireland's security team, where my job is really all around financial crime prevention. And I suppose that covers everything from understanding current and new financial crime threats and making sure that our processes and systems are the best they can be to stop those, to sharing intelligence either internally or more widely with some industry groups, supporting Gardaí with information for their investigations, and then some more specific areas around things like finding and shutting down phishing websites targeting Bank of Ireland, or recovering customer data from dark web markets like credit or debit cards that might be up for sale. I'm conscious I'm already using some jargon, and I think that's something that's unfortunately overused in these kind of discussions, and it can sometimes make all of this seem very complicated and complex. You'll no doubt have noticed that there's never a mention of fraud or cybercrime in the media that doesn't say that the criminals and their schemes are, becoming increasingly sophisticated. And while there's an element of truth in that, I think the important thing to remember is that there's some very simple things you can do to protect yourselves and your businesses. So what I'd like to cover over the next couple of minutes are just really the most common types of financial crime we see. And as I said, a couple of things that you can do to stop them. I know you're all here as members of a business organization, but I'll also mention the main threats we see for consumers. As we're all consumers at the end of the day, and a lot of the lessons and messages I think are applicable to business life anyway. I'd say up front that I'm not really going to talk about anything too technical. There's obviously a very important role for tools and systems that protect you and your businesses, but the best defenses against financial crime are often the simple things. So if I start by maybe asking you to think about your own businesses and what you have that would be of interest to a criminal, and I think you can probably put that in two categories. The first one is your data, and that could be things like customer details or business plans or financial records. And the second is the obvious one, which is your money. If I just touch on the data angle very briefly first, I think Paul already mentioned ransomware and the financial implications, but there's an increasing trend where criminals will release or threaten to release confidential data they've extracted. And look, I don't need to tell you the impact that could have on your business. Coming from a banking background, though, I'm obviously more familiar with the second category and the ways that a fraudster will try to get your money. And if I think about the kind of fraud we see every day, we could literally spend hours here and I could tell you about all sorts of new and different scams, but we could never cover everything because the fraudster will always come up with a new scam and a new story. And really anything that's topical becomes a hook for a fraudster, whether that's COVID or Brexit or anything else you can think of. So really I'd say don't worry too much about the how or what the specific scam might be. Again, remember what fraudsters are after, which is your money. And I think if you do that, it's a little easier to see what are the things you need to do to protect yourself. For consumers, the frauds that we see are generally some variety of the fraudster trying to get you to give them your online banking login details or your credit card number, your debit card number. But for businesses, generally it's more often the fraudsters are just trying to dupe you into making a payment from your account into their account. And you know, you'll hear people talking about payment redirection fraud and business email compromise fraud. And again, you know, they all sound very sophisticated and complex, but all they really are is just varieties of the fraudster trying to make you make a payment from your account into their account. And as a couple of people have mentioned, almost without exception, it starts with an email. So you'll get an email that looks like it came from your supplier saying something like, we've changed our bank account, so can you update that in your payment system? Or someone in your accounts department will get an email that looks like it's come from a manager in your business asking them to make a payment. Or one of the slightly newer ones, but I suppose you can't really call it new anymore, someone in your payroll team will get an email that looks like it came from a staff member saying that they have a new bank account and can you update the system for the next payroll run. Those emails obviously all just coming from a fraudster, but unfortunately in too many cases the payment is just made off the back of the email request or instruction. And if there was one thing, if there was only one thing that you took away from today, I'd love it to be this, which is don't worry too much about the how and the why. Make sure that every single request to change account details or to make a payment is verbally checked with a known contact at a known phone number. Lift the phone to a contact you know, on a phone number you know or have in your records, and say, hi, I'm just making a quick call to verify that email you sent to me. And look, I can't emphasize this enough, and I know it sounds very simplistic, but by doing that, you'll stop this type of fraud happening in your business. And as business owners and managers, I'd really encourage you to make sure that everyone in your business knows this too, and that they're empowered to question and verify any emails asking for payments to be made or account details to be updated. You know, we've seen cases where, you know, a junior member of staff gets an email that looks like it's coming from the boss asking to make an urgent payment, and they don't really feel, God, can I really go and question this? So, you know, get that out up front and say, no, any email like that, if there's money going out the door, I want you to check it first. And you know, it's a very simple check, but it can save a whole heap of pain down the track. And you know, it can sometimes feel like this might only happen to big businesses, but unfortunately it's so common and can impact everyone. And sometimes really for a fraudster, the attractive target is an SME where someone is juggling lots of balls and maybe feels they don't have the time to go chasing every email that comes in. I mentioned for consumers, the main risk is a fraudster trying to get their online banking details or their credit or debit card details. And typically the way we see this happening is a phone call or a text message. Interestingly, emails phishing for your banking details are almost non-existent at this stage, probably for a variety of reasons, not least the fact that text messages are a far more immediate mechanism and are obviously sort of briefer and less formal. So some of the typical warnings about things like looking out for bad grammar and so on might not apply. While it's rare for that kind of fraud to happen on the business side, it's not impossible, particularly voice calls. And we have seen cases where businesses got calls from people claiming to be generally the bank and gave away online banking login details. So again, for businesses and for all of us as consumers, the best advice is to just be very conscious of what you have that a fraudster will want and keep those details safe. You know, any online banking pins or codes that you have, when you stop and think about it, they're only for you to get into your account or to make or confirm a payment. So never ever give them to anyone, no matter who they say they are or why they say they need them. And look, I know that sounds all perfectly logical and obvious at 8:30 on a Thursday morning when we're having a chat about financial crime, but the fraudster will catch us at 6:30 in the evening when we've had a day of it and we're trying to get the dinner ready and look after the kids, and there's a call or a text from the bank about some suspicious payment and it's urgent and it's about to leave your account now. But the nice person on the call will be able to stop it if you can just confirm a few details. you know, I always like the branding on some of the UK financial industry fraud awareness campaigns, which is take 5. You know, take 5 to stop and think, take 5 minutes. Don't be pressured into anything. And remember, as I said, your online banking pins and codes are only for you to get into your account or to make or confirm a payment. So never ever give them to anyone, no matter who they say they are or why they need them. So look, that's just a whistle stop tour of a couple of the most common things we see. Hopefully there were a couple of things that resonated with you, and great, I would be delighted if there's any questions that come up. Just before I hand back to Rachel, I'll just mention very briefly, lots more information and advice on our website. If you just search Bank of Ireland Security, you'll find a range of information there. Thank you.
Thanks a million. That was actually quite reassuring. That protect the cash and really you're reliant on people to double check. And if you have that environment where people feel safe, it makes a difference. I just wanted to know sorry, this is my own question and I'll go to the Q&As, but is much money being recovered from the scams that are being mentioned? Katrina, would you know that, or Paul? Katrina?
Yeah, just I'll step in there just to reiterate about the time frame. Like if we're seeing once-off payments being targeted, say we're seeing solicitors firms or people going for e-tenders for government tenders, so the fraudsters are aware of these. And if a solicitor gets a phishing email to forward those funds to accounts outside the jurisdiction, well, what we're seeing is in the first 24 hours, we're having great success here in the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, working with the Financial Intelligence Unit and other financial intelligence units globally, that we're able to get that money back. So it all depends. It really depends on the time period. Some frauds aren't discovered until 20 or 30 days. At that stage, the money is gone. But what we would say is if you are a victim of an invoice redirect or a CEO fraud or any type of fraud like that, where a sum of money has gone, the first thing you do is you get onto your bank in order to recall it, and then you go to your local Garda station to report it. And if it's a large amount, and at a Garda station, if they're not seeing the urgency, we have a number of members of Garda Síochána trained, but if they're not seeing the urgency of it, we will give the details here of the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau for IT Cork to put up on the website to who to contact. And I'll pass you over to Paul in relation to what they're seeing in regards to recalls.
Actually, and yeah, exactly as you said, it's hard to put a number on it, Rachel. Fortunately, yes, we're recovering the majority of funds that go away, but as Katrina said, time is so critical. You know, if you think of sort of bank payment cycles and so on, if a payment, if somebody makes a payment right now and they're talking to us in the next hour, there's a very good chance that we'll be able to stop that, because it'll be within the payment cycle. Unfortunately, though, sometimes these things come up. I mean, if I take the simple example of somebody changing an account on a salary system or on a payroll system, that mightn't come to light until the next payroll run happens and you get a phone call from one of your staff saying, I didn't get paid this month. And by the time you dig into it and go, well, you did, and we updated your account details. But at that stage, the money is long gone, because look, once it lands at the other end into the fraudster's account, they're moving it on very quickly. So to answer your question, yes, a good proportion of funds are recovered, but time is so critical. So as soon as you know anything, or as soon as you even suspect anything, get on to us. We've 24/7 emergency numbers, and as Katrina says, report it to the Gardaí as well.
Okay. Another question that just came through there in the chat, in terms of white hat hackers, I suppose that's more Paul Ho. Would you recommend people having rewards, bigger companies having rewards for white hat hackers, or you're on mute?
Sorry, the story of my life these days, I'm afraid. Yeah, like there is the theory that you know, white hat hacking is a way to ensure you're comfortable with your security setup. But be careful what you wish for, I would say. I suppose is you inviting people to attack your environment is always can bring with it some threats. So I wouldn't necessarily, bigger rewards is probably a dangerous thing to do. I think having a more complete posture, if you will, so as in you know, a trained workforce or educated workforce and an IT security team that you know, are part of the wider security community and are aware to the threats is probably the most recommended approach, I would say.
Okay. Thanks for that. Another question is, what advice would the panel give in relation to managing insider threat in relation to fraud? And so, Paul or Bernard?
Yep. Bernard, do you want to lead out on that?
Like this, I suppose that's in the tech world, a lot of what we talk about is cybercrime, and and I know that most of the people that are on this call are looking at, you know, protecting the environment probably from external threats now at the moment, but internal threats are there, like, and they're obvious. Sometimes the remote working, I suppose one thing that we haven't seen is, you know, the expectation, you know, usually is that, you know, somebody takes 2 weeks off and you'll find out, you know, if they've been part of a fraud internally. That flow of expectation, given that we're all remote working now, you know, we were expecting to see a lot more of that. That actually hasn't happened as of yet, you know. So managing that internal control threat, there still is controls that need to be put in place and observed there. And I think one of the things, you know, the focus of us going and looking at a business as usual model immediately might have taken our focus away from anti-fraud controls internally, you know, and compliance generally internally. So, you know, one of the things that we are saying is like that overall, you know, the continuous monitoring of our systems, knowing what our business risks are internally and externally, you know, and managing that, you know, through an effective financial crime compliance program internally, you know, is the only way to work towards preventing that. Usually collusion, you could have the best controls in place, and collusion, you know, to bypass that between two people, and external supplier and an internal party, you know, it's something that you can't control against. But, you know, monitoring and keeping on top of your employees and knowing about your employees, you know, communication at the moment, you know, and oversight, knowing, you know, what's happening with your employees, you know, are they struggling or what, you know, things like that. You know, what like typical red flags that they say, like, have they bought new houses, have they bought new cars, you know, these kind of red flags that have always been there in relation to a business are still the same red flags. It's just you mightn't see them as much now, given that the communication channels are not as open as they were between, you know, seeing people out on the floor just saying hi and developing that conversation. Now that we're working remotely, we're only talking to people for work reasons. You know, so that the conversation element and what's going on in somebody's life is actually being lost for the organization.
Yeah, no, actually there's a question just that adds on to that in relation to staff training, saying our staff training and extra internal controls for prevention of financial crime. Are companies actually focusing on the right issues in training and controls, would you think?
Again, this is part of, you know, adapting to what they are. So, like, you know, what we had 9 months ago might not be relevant today and might not be relevant for the future. You know, so the remote environment and working in this, you know, working, if we want to call it the new normal, there's going to be that permanent shift or a blended way of working, you know, being in the office and being at home. And we'll probably end up, you know, with 50% maybe of our employees that carry out admin functions, you know, they can do them at home and probably end up there at home. So, you know, we need to look at that. Organizations need to look at that and manage that risk. That is a change in their risk profile, and they need to be cognizant of that. And you know, if you let your guard down, you know, you're always going to be vulnerable here. Like, you know, so today we might all be focusing on cybercrime, you know, but, you know, the vulnerabilities that are still there in relation to the internal measures still need to be managed and looked at. It's probably not good enough anymore just looking at your controls on an annual basis. It's a continuous it's a continuous assessment that, you know, that needs to be made business ready to be able to, I suppose, trade in what we are going to be in a new world. We're going to be working at home. We're going to be dealing with suppliers, new suppliers over the phone, entering new contracts, being aware of the third-party risk, and implementing the internal risks that we have and the external risks are just going to be key for any business going forward.
No, that's really, so you would consider people still to be kind of the weakest link, you know, rather than, yeah. But
people,
has to.
People cause, you know, it's human error. You know, we talk about, you know, putting in antivirus software, and we talk about putting in, you know, the best cyber controls that we can have. But if you don't turn them on and you don't have the right people turning those on, and the errors that are made just generally in business and poor judgment now, like, you know, definitely what we've seen from going into organizations, people are making poor decisions because they're not talking to other people within the organization because they're not sure. They're not sure the controls that are there. They're not sure the new controls. So that training element in relation to those new controls is vital. It is vital, and you know, you go into business and we talk about whistleblowing now, you know, where you go in and you know that tone from the top and creating awareness. We need to bring something similar in relation to the awareness that, you know, we are working in that new environment. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to communicate. You know, because without that full understanding of how we're meant to work and adapting to those new controls and new environments, there's going to be challenges for businesses that maybe they're not fully focused on at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. In terms of the size of the businesses who are being impacted by fraud, are you seeing an increase? Paul, you actually mentioned that pubs, you know, a pub was being impacted. A friend of mine, when she heard about this webinar, messaged me last night to say that it's a small family-owned business. They'd recently been scammed out of €7,000. Now they contacted the guards and went through that process. But are you finding, is it more of a threat for multinationals, or are smaller businesses being impacted more?
Yeah, I can lead out on it. I'm sure Paul and Katrina have commentary on this as well. But I think the key thing to remember is it can happen to anyone. We're seeing it from the small SMEs, the mom and pop shops, right through to multinationals that are doing, you know, a huge volume of transactions on a daily basis. And I suppose the challenge for the smaller businesses and the SMEs is that, you know, they're being attacked with the same sophistication and the same process as the multinationals who are throwing millions of pounds at defending against this situation. So I always do feel sorry for those smaller businesses that, you know, are trying to build a strong cyber posture, but you know, with probably limited resources and budget, and are being attacked with the exact same methodology as you know, the huge multinationals that are defending this. So to be honest, we're seeing it across the board. Realistically, the multinationals or the bigger businesses tend to catch this earlier because they have more resources and more ability to do so. So the SMEs are usually the businesses that suffer in these scenarios. But it's across, it's across spectrum. Sorry, Paul.
No, sorry, Paul. I was just going to agree with exactly what you're saying there. That in our experience, some of the people who tend to get caught more are, as you said, the SMEs that maybe the bigger companies might have more I suppose, embedded or advanced systems or processes in place, and it can sometimes tend to be the smaller companies where, you know, as I said when I was chatting earlier, that, you know, you've got somebody who's juggling 25 balls in the air and maybe doesn't have the time to go and look into something in more detail, and, you know, there's something urgent and they have to, you know, just get on with life and get on with the business. And unfortunately, they're the businesses that tend to get impacted, and it tends to have more of an impact, you know, as much as sort of 10,000 or 20,000 lost to a bigger business obviously is a serious issue, but, you know, that can have a horrendous impact. And Rachel, you mentioned your friend there, you know, 7,000 or 8,000 to a pub, particularly in the environment at the moment where there's no money coming in the door, could be, you know, sorry, not to be too dramatic, but could be catastrophic, you know, in terms of the business.
Big difference. Yeah.
I just add in relation to that, like, it's detrimental. A small company that comes in with a loss like that, we're seeing the human element, the injured party. They're broken when they're reporting something like that to us. Again, reputational damage, we mightn't see the Garda Bureau, Garda National Economic Crime Bureau, it mightn't be reported. However, just the awareness there of Section 19 of the Criminal Justice Act 2011, where you see something like that, and the obligation to report. We just remind people of that as well.
In terms of first steps, if you have discovered a fraud in your business, should your first thing be to ring the bank to try and stop it, or ring the police first? Any opinion?
Bank first. The bank first. The bank is the person. That's our advice. Is you're the holder of that account. You can get a stop put on that far quicker than on Garda Síochána, because you've control of the account. So your first port of call is to contact your bank, and as Paul said, they have a 24/7 service. So contact them and then report the matter, and they'll advise you to report the matter to Garda Síochána. And after this too, we have our website and we've a lot of information up in relation to different types, especially for your audience and for businesses out there, different types of scams that's out there, and answers and questions and that frequently asked questions in relation to it.
Yeah, and Rachel, I'd say the same. Get onto your bank as quickly as you can, because, you know, as Katrina said, we've access to the accounts and to the payment systems, and, you know, the quicker you're onto us, the quicker or the more chance there is of it being able to intercept a payment. And look, as you know, we will obviously be recommending that you go to the Gardaí with it, and, you know, in an awful lot of cases, particularly for the bigger ones, we would work very closely with Katrina and the team there, so we would be onto them very, very quickly anyway, if we think there's something they can do to help us with, which there very often is, particularly, as I say, on the bigger ones. You know, there was a couple of recent ones that you might have seen reported in the media where it was very much a joint effort where we were chasing it from a bank to bank perspective. But then the Garda National Economic Crime Bureau were getting onto their contacts in the other jurisdiction to try and help with that as well.
Okay, I'm a bit conscious of time. Have you any final words, any kind of top tips, or any particular threats that you're seeing out there that you think people, you know, that have emerged recently that you think people should be particularly aware of?
I just add one thing just to what Katrina and Paul just mentioned there. Like, you know, that's the response. You know, should a fraud happen, like, you know, companies and organizations need to have that response plan, need to be prepared for, you know, instances of fraud if they are impacted in the business, you know, and not to assume, not to be reacting to it, you know, and you know, moving it up the channels. Like, if there's an immediate response, i.e. ring the bank, that should be down on a list, and, you know, creating that awareness to the people that are, you know, within that banking function, or the people that have identified it. Just something very simple like that will, you know, as time is the most crucial element here, you know, will save an awful lot of time, rather than filtering through an organization to get to the person that, you know, is going to ring the bank. You know, we should be aware that at our lowest level, you know, in our organization, pick up the phone to the bank. Stop.
Anything they want to add before we finish up? Good. All that's left me to do is just say thanks so much to our panel this morning. Thanks to everyone who attended. Definitely an important topic, and one we'll be thinking of later and putting stuff into action. I want to thank as well John Marini, who's the chair of the IT or TikTok committee, and thank Julia Crowley and Vivian Manning for their help putting together this call. Conscious nearly not common when we don't have travel to work anymore. We may want to switch over to work environment. Thank you all again. Okay.
Thank you.